Hi, my name is Lapilo, and today I want to discuss de-dollarization. Since the 1970s, when the Nixon administration terminated the convertibility of the US dollar to gold, there have been strong argumentation predicting the end of the dollar's global dominance as a reserve currency and as the main transaction medium. Since then, there has been a popular belief of an imminent US dollar collapse, assuming the dollar's value resided in its convertibility to gold. However, as Adam Smith would argue, wealth doesn't reside in gold itself but on what it can buy. On this video, I will show you why the US dollar is not likely to lose its dominance, at least not in the short and mid-term. The US dollar is not the world's preferred currency by chance. The US dollar is not only backed by the strongest economy in the world, but also by the most reliable and transparent institutions currently. China is not even close to having transparent, independent institutions similar to the US. As we went through on one of my previous videos, the US-led global order is based on free market economy, and in the long run, free economies are by far more efficient in capital allocation and thus more prosperous. The real danger to this order is if China and the BRICS economies become bigger than the American order and therefore become more efficient through economies of scale. As we can see with Chinese electric vehicles, although this also depends on government subsidies which sparked countermeasures such as high tariffs by Turkey and Brazil, for example. We'll touch on this later in the video. BRICS countries are likely to grow more than developed countries in the future, but under the American-led order, as Li Lu explained on the same video, the question posits itself: could the US dollar be dethroned as the world's reserve currency? And which currency could substitute it? The Chinese Renmimbi? Perhaps gold? Each has its own problems. A gold standard wouldn't allow monetary expansion of the sort that prevented a world economy collapse in 2020 and could have prevented the 30s harsh depression. So most countries' establishments wouldn't be interested at all in returning to a gold standard. We're left with the renminbi. We'll look into that possibility later. First, let's admit there are some weak spots on the US dollar dominance. Some of the main arguments for de-dollarization include: the US is expanding debt, the weaponization of the US dollar and consequent disposition from authoritarian countries to diversify away from the dollar, the belief that the American public is benefiting from an artificially priced dollar and simultaneously from real debt reduction with inflation, central banks' gold purchases and foreign reserves diversification with no special winner except for gold, Saudi Arabia not renewing its contract with the US in which it supposedly promised to sell oil exclusively in US dollar. By the way, the YouTube channel Plain Bagel debunks this argument by showing there was no such promise. I would strongly suggest you watch it. Some of the main arguments in favor of the US dollar remaining the reserve currency include: the US economy backs the US dollar and is by far the most attractive investment market and accompanied by credible independent institutions. There's no serious contender BTC or gold wouldn't make quantitative easing possible to avoid major recessions such as 2008 and 2020. A new one without protective monetary policies could end up wiping civilization out. The renminbi is too controlled and has the Chinese economy backing it, which is increasingly controlled by the state, leading to a lack of trust in independent institutions. The credibility is just not there. There's not enough understanding and intention to cooperate between BRICS besides the common exposure to the threat of US sanctions. Although central banks are buying more gold, it doesn't necessarily mean the US dollar will collapse, and that investors won't prefer United States assets and US dollar-denominated assets to gold or other currencies. The main contender is the Chinese renminbi. However, besides the lack of transparent and independent institutions, there are other factors making the renminbi not a viable alternative. As the author of the book Red Flags, Why Xi's China is in Jeopardy, George Magnus observes in his interview to the market, after being asked, can they achieve a de-dollarization? This is not like changing a pair of shoes. I don't think many of the people that advocate de-dollarization, which includes some emerging countries or the crypto crowd, which has a vested interest in undermining the dollar-based system, really have thought this through. It's very easy to talk about de-dollarization, but to really achieve it, you'd have to turn the entire global financial and economic system on its head. I don't think that's going to happen. This does not mean that the dollar will forever be the dominant currency, but for the foreseeable future I don't think it's under a great threat. The interviewer asks, Saudi Arabia selling crude to China for yuan, or Brazil selling soy to China and getting paid in yuan, that's not de-dollarization to you? George goes on to explain if you sell products for yuan instead of dollars, you are technically de-dollarizing. But what really matters for the global monetary system is not the currency in which you settle your trade, but the currency in which you accumulate your balances. If you are Saudi Arabia and you peg your currency to the dollar, you have no use for accumulating balances in yuan. You need dollar reserves. If you are Brazil and you are exporting commodities that are globally priced in dollars, you have to accumulate liquid dollar reserves. The dollar system allows large imbalances in the global economy to accumulate because the United States is unique in allowing unfettered foreign access to all of its assets, be it bonds, equities, or real estate. If the people who are advocating de-dollarization really wanted to achieve it, it would mean that China, Germany, Japan, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, etc., would no longer be able to run current account surpluses if the US no longer accommodated their surplus savings. It would mean imposing symmetry between surplus and deficit nations. Do you really think the surplus countries would want that? Take the latest BI's triennial survey. The share of the dollar in reported global reserves has dropped from roughly 70% to 58% since 2000, but the gainers were the Australian and the Canadian dollar, the Swedish krona, and the Korean won. These currencies are like satellite currencies of the dollar-based system. They are not substitutes. The reason that people do accumulate them is because these countries also have the rule of law on liquid, convertible currencies. The yuan share of reserves has picked up from next to nothing to maybe 5% today. It could change if Beijing removed capital controls, making the yuan fully convertible, thereby allowing foreigners to accumulate onshore claims against China. But these changes would entail the loss of control that is greatly prized by the CCP. This might be acceptable to a future Chinese leader, but not to Xi. Regarding talks about a BRICS currency, George explains if I twisted my own arms, I could possibly see them setting up something they might call a BRIC, which is an accounting unit for settlement of transactions, in much the same way the special drawing right is an accounting unit for the IMF. But I don't see a BRICS currency. How would it be valued? What would it be linked to? China has a convertible currency only for current account transactions, not for capital transactions. A BRICS currency is really just a fancy way of talking about a pumped-up internationalization of the yuan in a way that makes the other members of the BRICS club feel better about it. So it's rather simple. As long as China's capital account remains mainly closed, there won't be any de-dollarization. The interviewer asks. There are certainly officials in the PBOCA government, as well as a number of economists in China, who think that not only is it unlikely that full internationalization can happen as long as capital controls are in situ, but also that it would be a bad idea. If they did abandon capital controls, it's highly likely that there would be a huge outflow of capital from China. The yuan would depreciate. That would compromise the stability of the financial system in China. There is an argument that the CCP doesn't trust its own citizens to keep their capital at home. That's why I don't think this is something that the CCP would ultimately endorse. Renminbi literally translates as the people's currency. The CCP must have control over the people's currency. Control is what drives Xi Jinping's interest. I'm not saying it would never happen, but I am confident that it won't happen under the leadership of Xi. George Magnus also gives us a comprehensive viewpoint in his article published at the Council of Geostrategy titled De-dollarization, Easier to Say Than Do. If a BRICS currency is a non-starter, or at least little more than a notional accounting unit, the focus is back on the yuan. The PRC has sometimes blown hot and cold about the idea of internationalizing the yuan, but it has remained a regular theme and talking point for over a decade now. For many, de-dollarization is principally about both the greenback's fading role in the global system and the rise of the so-called redback. Much of the discussion centers around the rising proportion of, or mentions about, trade that is denominated in yuan. This is certainly true of Russia, where the circumstances since its full-scale invasion of Ukraine have meant that Russia had no option but to do more trade with the PRC and to use the yuan more to invoice and settle accounts. About a quarter, perhaps more now, of Russian imports and exports are settled in yuan, and nearly all of the PRC's oil imports from Russia are too. There has also been talk this year about Saudi Arabia, Bangladesh, Iraq, Thailand, Iran, Argentina, Pakistan, and Brazil possibly looking to invoice or settle more trade in yuan. At the same time, the PRC has been arranging central bank swap arrangements where central banks swap one another's currency for short but renewable periods with other central banks as a way of making yuan available for loans or for liquidity. At a bit more than $15 billion PS1 $1.8 billion in swap facilities, the PRC's offerings have expanded sharply since 2015 and 2016, when they hardly existed, and now this marketplace is worth hundreds of billions of dollars. It has also been trying to build out its own international payment system architecture known as Cross-Border International Payment System or CPIS as an alternative to the global and heavily US dollar-based chips and SWIFT systems used for payments and messaging of transactions, respectively. The PRC's goal here, of course, is also to sanction proof itself, if at all possible by dispensing with the need to process transactions through us and global banks. The comparisons of the two systems reveal that the PRC's architecture cannot really substitute for that of its global peer, except perhaps for a relatively small group of like-minded states. SWIFT is a system with over 11,000 participants in 200 countries, and in which the US dollar, euro, and yuan account for 42, 35, and 3% of transactions, respectively. CPIS is a payment system with 79 direct and 1,348 indirect members in 138 countries, comprising mostly Chinese banks. It relies on SWIFT, moreover, for messaging. It is a way in which countries can avoid the US dollar system, but it is not a tool for the internationalization of yuan, as such. George goes on to explain why the US dollar will rule for the foreseeable future in this respect. There simply is not a viable alternative to the US dollar for the foreseeable future. The relative appeal of the US dollar remains robust, relying on a set of 5 advantages. First, inertia. It takes a major upheaval to shake a reserve currency out of its role and replace it with something that is at least its equal. Second, network effects. The US dollar is universally used, acceptable, tradable, and mostly trusted. Third, deep and flexible capital markets. The US has mostly unparalleled capital markets, certainly outside of the Organization for Economic Colorado Operation and Development area. Fourth, clear and transparent governance and rule of law. These are indispensable qualities for a trusted global currency. And fifth, low discrimination between domestic residents and foreigners. Other than those unlucky enough to be sanctioned, all participants are treated as equals. The US dollar certainly occupies an anomalous position, accounting for a far smaller proportion of world trade and world GDP than seems to be compatible with its dominant role in global loans, bonds, foreign exchange, trade invoicing, and SWIFT payment transactions. It is true that the US dollar share of recorded official foreign exchange reserves has fallen from about 60 to 65% a decade ago to about 58% today. 18 yet. This anomalous position and the reasons for the fall in the share of official reserves are usefully contextualized by the Bank of International Settlements. As the BIS makes clear, the reason for the US dollar's declining share in recent years especially has been because of the increase in those of the Australian and Canadian dollars, the Swedish krona, and the South Korean won, but not the yuan, whose share has remained fairly stable at about 3%. It is also worth noting that official reserves may not be capturing all of the official flows into US dollars, including especially those accumulated by the PRC, due to the purchases made by state banks, and also sovereign wealth funds as proxies for the central bank. The yuan currency system, on the other hand, offers few if any of these attributes, and the Chinese Communist Party's CCP lurch in recent years towards greater control, politicized regulation, and clampdowns and campaigns against private firms, and also some foreign enterprises has exacerbated an uncomfortable situation. Along with new data, cybersecurity, and counter-espionage laws and regulations, these developments have soured the appetite for Chinese portfolio assets and accentuated discomfort on the part of foreign enterprises, at least as far as future investment is concerned. There is little chance, moreover, that Chinese macroeconomic policies will facilitate either of the only two ways in which the yuan could become a serious rival to the US dollar. Put another way, to have a global currency that is materially bigger, say, than the Australian and Canadian dollars, Japanese yen, Swiss franc, and sterling, foreigners must be able to accumulate claims on the PRC, that is, acquire substantial yuan assets. One way this can happen is if the PRC were to run big and persistent balance of payments deficits rather than surpluses. Yet to do this, the PRC would have to abandon the mercantilist and supply-side policies that perpetuate the running of those surpluses. The CCP would need to change the PRC's development mode, and undertake extensive reforms to boost the consumption and income shares of GDP, reform the tax system, which is highly regressive, expand the social welfare system, and redistribute income and wealth from the state to the private sector. There is not even a slim chance that Xi Jinping's PRC is contemplating such policies, or that it would. The other way is to abandon the stringent controls over the outward movement of capital that have been in situ for a while, but which were tightened after domestic financial turbulence in 2015 to 2016. If that happened, foreigners would be able to acquire yuan claims as Chinese residents, firms, and households invested abroad. The likelihood of this happening is negligible for two reasons. First, large capital outflows would almost certainly lead to a sharply lower currency, which would compromise severely the CCP's craving for control and the stability of the financial system. Second, the CCP certainly does not trust its own citizens or the private sector to keep wealth in the PRC. Since neither of these options is acceptable to the CCP or likely to be embraced in the foreseeable future, the internationalization path of the yuan must, by definition, be strictly limited. He concludes, absent a political catastrophe or international crisis that compromises America's willingness or ability to abide by the rules of the current monetary system, it is difficult to make a plausible case as to why the US dollar's dominance will not persist for the foreseeable future. Global reserve currencies do not shift around in popularity like shares listed in the Financial Times Stock Exchange or Dow Jones. They occupy critical and pivotal roles in the monetary system, and the role the US dollar plays is unprecedented and, for now at least, irreplaceable. It is possible that one day, America might decide that the reserve currency role, championed by the establishment and by Wall Street, was placing too much of a burden on the economy and on jobs. This domestic focus has become deeply embedded, for example, in the recent articulation of industrial policy and the marriage of economic and foreign policy by Jake Sullivan, the U.S. National Security Advisor. It is unlikely anytime soon that the U.S. government would try to reorder the world's monetary system, but recent developments show at least that beliefs and priorities are starting to shift. The main message to take away, though, is that it is not possible to upend the world's monetary system and pivotal currency without upending the entire world trading system too. If the US were to change and relinquish its role as the principal absorber of the surpluses of other countries, including especially the PRC, then everything else has to change too. US deficits would contract as US savings rose, and Chinese and other surplus countries' surpluses would have to contract or disappear because that is the other side of the global balance of payments. This would impose huge costs on and necessitate major policy reversals in the PRC and other countries with surpluses that would have unexpected and unpredictable consequences, including for political stability and governance systems. Magnus finishes his article by saying, "De-dollarization rolls off the tongue easily enough, but its supporters and advocates do not really know that they are playing with fire."
Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with your people.